I do want to ask you this, because you are an academic in this space, right? How do you define Web3 for people when you meet them?
So I would usually have to give a little runway of what was Web 1 and what was Web 2.
How do you
Right?
define Web 1 and 2 then, I guess?
Well, to me, Web 1 is static web pages. You can read it, but you can't contribute. A good example would be the Encyclopedia Britannica online. Back when it came out, you're welcome to read it. And maybe you can even click on hypertext links that take you to other pages. And there's a vast amount of information to be learned. But unless you're a coder, there's no interaction with this. It's completely static. Web 2 was this incredible movement to bring interactivity away from the coders and into everyone's hands. So it is Facebook, Instagram, Wikipedia, there's a couple eBay, or, there's all of these things. And I'm sure Discord, what's this one I look at? Reddit. Reddit is the only social media I will look at, which is a weird choice, but I do look at Reddit once in a while. And all of that stuff, you can contribute as much as you want, and it's no longer about static information. That has some issues with it because of two main things. One is centralization, and the other is credibility. So for centralization, you can go and you can add information, but you have no control over what they do with your information. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to these big gatekeepers. And these gatekeepers, this is something I spend a lot of time on in my law class, is, to me, the modern corporation is very similar to a vampire. It lives forever. It has no morals or ethics unless it's regulated. Its only goal in the whole world is profits. By law, that's its only goal. So it drinks blood, it lives forever, it has no ethics. It's a vampire.
That's great.
We have
modern corporation as a vampire, right?
Well, there was a study done. So I teach law and I teach organizational behavior. And I teach some management also, but for organizational behavior, there was a study done maybe, I don't know, 6-7 years ago, where they gave a personality test to different corporations, and all of them had the exact same personality: sociopathic, homicidal, maniac.
That's scary.
It's very scary because corporations own vast tracts of this earth. And potentially other planets as well. And they are the things that are getting us off this planet. They control food. They control the climate. Corporations control everything. And it's so recent. We're talking about the late 1880s is when the Joint Stock Act was passed in the UK, and the case Salomon v. Salomon established that creditors are not liable for the debts of a corporation, or shareholders are not liable for the debts of a corporation, and a corporation is a separate legal entity. A separate legal entity. We made people. We just made them without souls. So way to go, us.
People on paper.
People on paper without souls who control everything.
So we digressed a little bit, but you were saying that this was Web 2.
Centralization and credibility. So this is the centralization issue, is that you have these gigantic companies that do whatever they want with the information. And credibility, when you look at something like Wikipedia or Reddit, everybody can contribute. Now that's great, but there's no way to verify what's true and what's not. Not to say that we could in Web 1, but when the Encyclopedia Britannica came online and you could read it, there was an assumption of credibility. Now that, I think, has just changed in our society. For my parents' generation, when they watched the news, there was an assumption of credibility. When they read the New York Times or the Washington Post, there was an assumption of credibility. That's changed, and maybe it needs to. Maybe we need to establish new forms of credibility, but that's Web 2, interactive web pages that are controlled by centralized authorities that more and more lack credibility. Get into Web 3. Web 3 is a different paradigm, but I think that's what makes it challenging. It's very similar to Web 2 in terms of interacting with web pages. What's changed is not that. What's changed is now people have their own ownership of their data. So that's a huge decentralization, rather than all of your data being owned by Google or Apple or Facebook or wherever, Meta, excuse me, now your information is owned by you. So that's one big change. And another big change is immutability to me, which is to say, when information is put out on the blockchain, it can't just be changed capriciously by Facebook or by Google. They can't change it. It's out there. Transactions are transparent. And I think that's really important too. So that's kind of
Web3 kind of is attempting to, I don't want to say solve, but improve the credibility and centralization issues that Web2 faced.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think so.
I mean, there's just a lot to unpack there, because one of the other aspects that I've talked about previously is that in Web3, you are what you do for the more than you ever have been, which is that, and it goes back to that immutability characteristic. What are you buying? What are you transacting? And all of that. And to me, that's the ultimate form of credibility. Now, the way that we interpret that credibility is still up in the air. It's everywhere. There's tons of different projects that are trying to tackle what true credibility is based on the immutable actions that you take on the blockchain. But it is a step in that direction, which is that, like, it's no longer the stuff that you're typing in Reddit. It is now the things that you are actually doing that determine whether or not someone should believe you, whether or not someone should spend time reading what you put out, or, you know, even socializing with you. And it's super exciting to see that that is possible. Now, we have a long way to go, but it is still cool.
Sure. I wish I had it pulled up here, but I don't. But there's a great quote from Gavin Woods, who was one of the co-founders of Ethereum, was the founder of Polkadot, and runs the Web3 Foundation. And he had said Web2, he said a lot of people, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, he said, you know, people think about Web2 kind of the way I described it, interactivity with web pages and things like that, but it's centralized. He said, think about it as feudalism. Web2 is feudal society, where you have these fiefdoms, you have princes, you have barons who own vast pieces. You can farm on their land if they let you, but you have no ownership rights whatsoever. And with that goes a sense of, you trust what this baron says, because what choice do you have? Either you don't farm and you don't eat, or you just give in to a very unfair system. And that's Web 2. We just didn't see it that way because it's so veiled by the technology. And he said Web 3 is simply a movement away from feudalism and towards a new social movement that can't really just be called capitalism. It's a new social movement. And I think that's what makes it hard to discuss with people. Is I talk to my family, for example, since I'm so involved in this, and they want to understand what it is, but what they want is they want to be told, you know, Web 2 is a computer. Well, Web 3 is Oculus. They just want that. Or Web 2 is, you know, talking on Zoom, and Web 3 is the metaverse. They just want a very simple, tangible explanation. To say to somebody it's a new form of social movement and governance, I mean, I'm sure you've heard the classic example of in 1995 when Bill Gates was being interviewed by David Letterman. You heard that?
Expand. I may have, but
I was talking to my brother-in-law, and he was asking, you know, of course they're making fun of me. You spend your money making imaginary money in the imaginary verse. And I'm like, all right. He said,
I'm getting made fun of.
And he said, well, can you explain it? And I told him to Google this interview from 1995, where David Letterman says to Bill Gates, what's the internet? And Bill Gates says, well, recently, for the first time, we were able to stream a baseball game. I think it was a Yankees game. Isn't that amazing? And David Letterman said, well, I have a radio. You ever heard of radio? And Bill Gates said, well, okay. He said, but you know, with the internet, you can play it again and again whenever you want. And David Letterman mocked him and said, have you ever heard of a tape recorder? And Bill Gates, and you could see he was trying to explain something that David Letterman, a very intelligent man, was not going to comprehend. He was trying to explain there's a new way of communicating and connecting with people. Anything you're interested in the whole world, you could find other people who are interested and enter sort of rooms with them and places where you can establish connections in a way you didn't previously. And David Letterman just sort of mocked this and said like, oh, you mean anything I'm into? But the point was, now we look back, that was 1995. Now we look back on what the internet has become and how it pervades the fabric of society. There's nothing that really doesn't connect with the internet. In fact, people are saying Wi-Fi is now a basic human right. So what Bill Gates saw, he was unable to convey in words. And I'm not saying I see that. I'm just a little piece of this machine, somebody who's trying to study it, somebody who's participating in it, working on thinking about new governance structures. In a lot of ways, all I do sometimes is I lead a meeting of very smart people and listen to them talk.
You're good at that.
I enjoy doing it.
Yeah.
I like running a class.
It's really hitting on your core skills, right? Like you've been a teacher for a long time. If you sucked at it, you'd be gone, right? I'm assuming that. And in our conversations together.
Not with the modern tenure system.
Yeah. Touche.